You know, I'm a physician originally by training and practice, and we had long hours and on-call and residencies, but I applaud and hats off to this audience. A long day, and I'm just pleasantly surprised by how many people are still engaged. It tells us the critical nature of the discussion we've had, but even more than that, I want to salute Edie, yourself, Heidi, and the whole team for putting this together. I'd also like to recognize Jim Clifton and the Gallup team for giving us an amazing place to hold our meeting. I mean, this is wonderful. I hope one day we can do this at PepsiCo. You'll see a different view out the window.
We'll accept that right away.
Yeah, you let me know. You let me know. There's one thing I can. All right. I would be delighted to host this meeting at the PepsiCo headquarters. And New York's not a bad place to come to. You know, as I've been listening to the conversation and the discussions, so much has been said around the critical nature of STEM, the shortage of our pipeline, the historical lack of diversity and the need for diversity, the need for public-private partnerships. And I don't want to repeat all of that. We recognize it. You know, as I think about it as, again, taking the medical analogy, the diagnosis is clear. We're short of talent, we're short of resources, we are short of the diverse thought, and I want to emphasize a couple of other things. We've had a lot of discussion about the need to do this to create sustainable businesses, grow our businesses, helping the bottom line. I want to go beyond that, though. There is a social imperative, and we sort of touched on it, but I'm going to give you one perspective that emphasizes a couple of numbers. We have 7 billion people on the planet today. We're going to have 9.5 billion, give or take 500 million, by 2050. That's within the lifetime of many people in this room. That's 2.5 billion more people who will need food, housing, transportation, energy, healthcare. I can go on and on. Add to that the fact that there's 1 billion people on the planet today who go to bed hungry every night. 1 billion people. That's about 3 times the number of people there are in the United States. Go to bed hungry every night. It's not just an emerging, developing market issue, by the way. 60 million Americans are on subsidized food, some form of food stamps. That's 1 in 5 Americans. I doubt any of those are represented in this room. And we talk about diversity. I want you to think about that. Their voice, part of the conversation, the definition of what STEM is, what STEM means to them, and what STEM means to, therefore, society. Some of us grew up. Part of society had the fortune for an education and got out, as so to speak, and I'm quoting others, to be part of this group. Let's not leave them behind. But as I'm going to talk to you today, unfortunately, we left 90% of the planet behind. 90% of the planet today, in one way or another, has been leapfrogged or left behind from technology. Technology has created lots of opportunities thanks to STEM. It has created lots of challenges. The 3rd generation taxi cab driver is essentially almost out of a job. When I was in school and I went to the bank to cash a check, there was a single mother who was cashing my check who had a job. We technologists left them behind. Not deliberately, but we did. So I've heard a lot today, and I want to be provocative as a leader, that as we think about STEM, we had better think about this very global problem of society's needs from STEM, not just an elite group's need for STEM. And how are we as leaders going to challenge ourselves in this process? I spent 9 years after medical school in training. Went to grad school, did residency, fellowship, all the rest of it. That's not necessarily the aspiration or the opportunity for the majority of people. Are we going to define STEM as somebody who has a degree in science, engineering, mathematics? The first original scientist, Aristotle, didn't say a degree was necessary. Aristotle's definition of a scientist, if you go back and read it, was a man or a woman who is trained and has the habit of observation, period. A man or a woman who is trained and has the habit of observation. That is what a scientist was a millennium ago. Has it changed? Our methods of training have changed. Our tools have changed. I grew up in college with the slide rule. I'll challenge most of the millennial young kids in this room to tell me how to use a slide rule. Doesn't make me any smarter or less smarter. It's just different tools. Now, what do I mean by all of this, and why do I bring it up? Because when you leave society, parts of society, and large parts of society behind, there are challenges. And those challenges get expressed in many ways. One of those is social stability. When that is threatened, people speak out. When you're hungry, when your children are hungry, when you don't have clean water, you speak out. And desperate people do desperate things. And this is not a US issue. However, we're not on our own, because if we isolate ourselves from the global challenge, then we no longer have a right to a voice, but unfortunately or fortunately, we are part of this global planet. We share the same atmosphere, we contribute the same greenhouse gases, and just as a simple example, our own food supply is a global food supply chain. Now let me give you a little perspective from the ag industry. I started my life practicing medicine, went to pharmaceutical industry, and now became a chips and soda guy. If I was any smarter, I'd probably do something else, but you know what? This is great. Chips and soda. But let me give you the complexity of the challenges. If we're going to feed 2 billion, 3 billion more people on the same amount of land with diminishing clean water resources and increasing pollution in the atmosphere, the number one contributor to water pollution is agriculture. The number one contributor to greenhouse gases is not transportation, it's agriculture. And if we're going to now double the agriculture activity on this planet, just think of the consequences. We had better figure this out. And it's going to take a whole variety of things to come together. It's going to take scientists, engineers, mathematicians, everything we've talked about, educators, NGOs, government. But I do like to ask my scientists a question, and that is, we can sometimes ask the question, what should we do? We always ask that. That's how science starts. What is the problem we want to solve? We ask ourselves, how are we going to do it? That's the process of science. All too often, as leaders, we've not asked the question, should we do it? And when we fail to ask that question, we may come up with technological breakthroughs that aren't the right ones, that may not solve the right problems, or we may not make the right trade-offs. So part of this conversation is not only STEM, but the application of STEM to society's problems and priorities, because there are no unlimited resources. This is where diversity of thought comes in. And as I look in my own organization, I've had the privilege of building many organizations in my own career. I've asked that question, whose voice needs to be at the table and what type of voice? And all too often in society, we've defined diversity because it's based on what you can see. I got so many women on my team, I got so many colored people. If I ask my grandson, he doesn't think I'm colored. It's all perspective and relative, and that's my point. However, when I had the chance to come to PepsiCo 8 years ago, and we had a challenge at our hands, Indra Nui, our chairman, asked me a simple question, Mehmood, think about the future of this company and its pipeline and its products, and think about what it should look like a decade, 2 decades from now. And your job is to shape the future of the pipeline, the processes, the products, the systems of this company. I sat in my office and asked a very simple question. We have a $70 billion a year, give or take a little bit, organization, $100 billion a year in revenue. 1.5 billion people consume one of my products every 24 hours. 1.5 billion people, it's about 1.3, 1.4 billion people actually physically consume. This is not software. It's not digitally touched. We make, move, and sell and deliver to 1.5 billion people a day. In 200 countries, there are more countries we do business in than there are members of the United Nations. And so you sit there in your office and you ask yourself, what is that future like and how we're going to change this company that's been around 100 years? And I've never worked in this industry or at this company. I have a tremendously visionary and courageous CEO. I hope she was smart enough to think about bringing me in from the outside. Many asked questions at the time. However, part of that decision was diversity of thought. Somebody from the outside, somebody who isn't part of this industry. It was nothing to do with what I look like. It's the fact that I had a very different background. And that's the critical part. Because when you start thinking like that, I made an observation of my own organization, and the leadership was made up of male, Caucasian, white engineers. I have nothing against engineers. My dad's an engineer. I have two brothers who are engineers. I grew up surrounded by engineers. However, when you have everybody at the table who's an engineer, you start thinking that all the problems are going to be solved by engineering solutions. We think a lot about STEM and we start thinking of IT immediately. There's a lot more to STEM than information, a lot more to it than engineering. And so we set about, in fact, my partner in crime at the time, Bev Taruli, was assigned the responsibility of becoming my HR partner and saying, partner with Mehmood and let's think about this from a people perspective. I didn't start thinking about products, by the way. We have $22 billion brands at PepsiCo. 22 blockbusters. That was not the problem. Question is the people. So we set about. We didn't actually start counting the diversity or anything. We just started looking for the best people with different technical backgrounds and different perspectives. 8 years later, more than half of my executive team are women. 3 of them did their PhDs outside the United States. Many trained in multiple countries through their career. And to me, that was diversity of thought. Different backgrounds. We have molecular biologists, biochemists, veterinary scientists, food regulatory scientists, I can go on and on. Suddenly, and 3 of them had never worked in the food and beverage industry. But they were critical to making us the leader in innovation in our industry that we are today. And I'm not boasting here, let me give you a simple statistic. 8 years later, we went from a company that did, say, a different color, different flavor of the same product, to today, if you look at incremental revenue in the United States in grocery stores, PepsiCo is the #1 contributor to growth, and the next 17 food and beverage companies combined equal PepsiCo's growth. The next 17 combined equal the growth. Net revenue at PepsiCo was around 4 to 5% of $40 billion base. Today it's 9% of a $70 billion base. Just do the math. It wasn't a nice to do, it contributed to the bottom line. I won't dwell on that any further. But if we don't solve humanity's challenges, whether you're in the food and beverage industry or the energy industry, we're going to have some major challenges. I think about my children. I'm blessed to have a grandchild. I think about my grandchildren's generation. And if we continue to do today what we are doing, our children and grandchildren will not be able to live on a planet where people have simple choices to make on food, water, clean water, and the air we breathe. And the only way that's going to get solved is we put the right scientists, technologists, mathematicians, engineers together, but scientists in the broadest definition as defined by Aristotle, not just those that we give graduate degrees to. Which brings me to the next part. As technology has leapfrogged many in our society, There are tens of millions now unemployed. And don't look at the unemployment figures you see, because there's a lot of Americans who aren't even looking for a job anymore. They're not even included in those statistics. And then if you combine that with the unemployment in Africa, Middle East, Asia, and as efficiency and systems get to displace jobs, which they are doing and they will continue to do at an exponential speed. 1998, Kodak sold 70% of the world's photographic paper. 3 years later, they were bankrupt. So do not kid yourself that if you're the industry leader today, that even a decade, let alone 5 years from now, you actually may not exist as the world's leader, let alone even exist as a corporation. If you think about it from that perspective, then it's going to take a very different mindset from our leaders. One is, of course, nimbleness, change, the ready and ability to embrace change. All too often, leaders fight that because status quo is comfortable. We live in a world where it's going to be increasingly uncomfortable, and we better get used to it as business leaders and as social leaders. But if we can figure this out, there are some amazing opportunities. 40% of the food that we grow on our planet is thrown in the garbage dump. It's wasted. One way or another, it's lost. 40%. If we could technically cut half of that, we'd feed the planet today with a zero impact on the environment. Just think of that as a grand challenge. Cut the food waste in our global system by half, and the entire planet is fed, and we do not have any increase in pollution, carbon footprint, you name it, whatever. We can do it. How much have we focused on production versus addressing this side of the equation? You draw your own conclusions. Okay? Having said that, there are a lot of aspiring young people who can contribute to our society that don't either need to or have the opportunity to have advanced degrees or even college degrees in STEM. And I challenge that for the STEM. Here's why. It's not that I have nothing against having a college degree. Obviously, we're all benefited. Most of us, if not everybody in this room, is benefited. And I think every child who has the opportunity should. The reality of it is 7.5 billion on the planet. We won't have the educational resources to do that tomorrow. But I'm also a pragmatist. How do we do it today? Well, I can tell you there's a lot of jobs out there that we hire an engineer with a degree in engineering and then we put them on a production line that, frankly, somebody with a 2-year training on the job could do. What a waste of resources and a mind that could have been contributing, who's now sitting there unemployed because they're too trained for one job and they're undertrained for another. What a pity. Is that because we've defined our version of STEM and education? That actually wasn't the case in my father's generation. That isn't the case in Germany today. There are other very successful education systems who are creating very capable people to contribute. Imagine that in life sciences and healthcare. Whether it's nursing, whether it's supporting. There are parts of the world people don't have medical degrees, and using technology, you're using concepts of physician extenders to provide very vital healthcare in inaccessible parts of the world. Some of those parts exist in this country. And they might be in inner cities or they might be in rural areas, but they exist today. I've done that in an earlier part of my career. Providing diabetes care to a single mother with 3 children in an inner city where medical care is not acceptably available. What is the alternative? Are we going to wait until another 10 years we train somebody? We're going to do something today. That mother's child is not going to wait for us to figure it out. That child is going to be born next year and needs our support and needs our care. So as you put all of this together, we have a tremendous opportunity as leaders. We can think about it, we can plan it, or we can parallel path. And the parallel path is more difficult, because it means trading off choices, which, by the way, all of you who are business leaders do every day. You make choices. You decide, I'm going to resource this and I'm not going to resource that. That's part of our jobs, and we're trained. And what we need to do now as leaders in STEM is say, we're going to turn around and say, we're going to make some parallel path choices. We're going to just do something in the short term. We're going to do something for the medium term. And we're going to invest in the long term for this pipeline. And if we do this right, by the way, some of that short-term pipeline will turn into our long-term pipeline. I can tell you, starting with my own father, he started off with a trade and ended up getting trained as an engineer as his children were growing up. At PepsiCo, we've created a partnership between PepsiCo and Rutgers to create a PhD program for women, who, particularly who are in our workforce, who can't leave their job and go back to grad school, but getting a PhD will unlock a lot of other potential in their career. So let's create the opportunity for them to finish their degrees. And I'm not talking about an after work course to do a master's. I'm talking about giving them lab space and supervision to do a science-based PhD in real time in our own labs. We created a PepsiCo Fellows program where the fellows are given 20 to 25% of their time free with resources, with budget, to go and do science and mentoring in anywhere they want for any student they want. And I can go on. And once you start doing that, two things will happen. You start to elevate people, but you also create a mechanism by which you start to capture and retain and recruit people who want to come into that ecosystem. My biggest problem right now is not in the short term growing PepsiCo's business. We're blessed. We have wonderful brands, wonderful people, and a global iconic system. It's not the challenge. That's not my job either. My biggest challenge is, as I look over the end of this next decade and people like me have retired, the average age of a scientist in this country, in industry, is now over 50, over the age of 50. The average age. In the next decade, almost half of the US-based industry scientists will have retired or will be soon retiring. Half. If you combine, forget we heard the IT deficiency with the securities, and if you combine all the pipeline that's coming out of colleges and universities, we won't be able to replace the retirees, let alone the expansion. So scientific leaders and executives like me will have a choice. And we're making that choice today. We either continue to build R&D capability in this country or we move it overseas, where we have a pipeline. This, in the global sense, has challenges too, because many industries have to have a local presence. They're global industries, but there's a local need, and that balance is getting out of sync. I had the honor, actually, a couple of weeks from now, I'll be delivering the commencement speech at my alma mater back in Minnesota at the College of Food Science and Ag. And I've been thinking hard about what to tell these young scientists, agronomists, nutritionists, veterinary scientists. And we have not made it easy for them, we being my generation. We created a glamour about going to Wall Street. We took our young scientists and they aspired, when they finished their degrees in mathematics or physics or whatever, they aspired to become bankers before they wanted to continue their training in science. They didn't do that. That's what we made aspirational. And while I have nothing against the banking industry or the finance industry, but if all of our STEM aspires to become a finance person, to take advantage of the discoveries of the scientists, well, who's making the discoveries? And that's what's happened. So in closing, I don't know what you want to take away from today's discussions, but I will leave you with a couple of things. One, yes, we need to invest in science. Second, we have a crisis. We recognize it. The third is, let us not look back in history on how we've solved this pipeline and crisis, but let's look to the future and be creative how we are going to solve it. Way too often we're looking in the mirror and figuring out, and I always, when I teach at different schools, I go, the future is not an extrapolation of the past. It's not that simple mathematical, take a line and extrapolate and that's the future. That is not the case. The the future is going to be very different. May not even be on the same page. Third is define diversity first and foremost as background and thought and experience and knowledge, not by physical appearance. Whether it's gender or race or anything will not matter. What will matter is how different your thinking is, because you'll bring creative thought to the table, which means we as scientists had better be open to people's inputs whose background might not be a graduate degree in science. Thank you very much.